So I think it'd be good to talk about how Matt and I initially met and started working together. Because I think that sort of describes the merger of blockchain tech and startup societies.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had been talking for a while online about startup cities and special economic zones, and kind of looked at that as the political decentralization to the blockchain decentralization, technological decentralization, and how those kind of fit together. And we finally got a chance to meet. What was it, January of last year?
Yeah, January, February.
Yeah, it was because it was before Trump got
Inaugurated.
So it was right before Bitcoin Miami, and we were there. I was planning the D10E, doing all the content in D10E in Bucharest that year, and so we finally got to meet up when we in DC in my old apartment, and we hung out, had some coffee, some beers, and within 20 minutes of like hanging out, we were like, oh, well, we have to plan a conference together. We're going to do a D10E and a startup societies, and we're going to bring together the best, ideas in the special economic zone and the governance frameworks with the actual technological solutions of building, a startup society from scratch. So what would you need? What types of applications would you want to do? And then what are the rule sets and what are the infrastructure? How can we tokenize infrastructure or tokenize the energy infrastructure? Or what types of governance like identity dApps would we use if we were going to build a society from the ground up? And so we got to ideate and hang out, and within 20, 30 minutes we were planning a conference in August in San Francisco. So.
No, it was absolutely amazing, and it was long overdue. I mean, the similarities between blockchain technology and special economic zones, maybe it's not completely intuitive to a lot of people, but for people in the decentralization space, it's fairly clear. It provides a way to change rule sets in a decentralized manner that you can opt into, or at least you can easily exit. So it was really important that we got those two groups together, because a lot of special economic zone experts, they're not very familiar with blockchain tech. And for the longest time, up until fairly recently, people in the blockchain space were not very familiar with special economic zones. They were focused almost purely on fintech, or other elements of blockchain technology outside of territorial governance. So the summit in San Francisco was absolutely fantastic. It had an enormous amount of fantastic people, and we finally got blockchain people to talk about SEZs and SEZ people to talk about blockchain applications. So I think that was fairly successful.
Yeah. Well, the one vision that I had when we were there, because I was like, this was a couple of years ago, at some point we're going to be able to ICO a city, right? We're going to be able to ICO some sort of jurisdiction, startup jurisdiction, whether it be a seastead or whether it be, a charter city somewhere floating, or whether it ends up being a moon colony, right? We can still eventually tokenize these startup societies and have
literally to the moon.
To the moon, hopefully cryptocurrencies go so high we can actually tokenize the moon, right? And so, but that was, and then we did get to give a presentation. You can take the real estate leases, and you can tokenize those revenue streams, and you can ICO basically a startup society. So if you were going to do Hong Kong again now, you could take those land leases and tokenize them and allow everyone to invest in it.
So a little context for those in the audience that don't know about the land lease model. It's the basic business model for private special economic zones, where a zone developer, they have the plot of land and they lease it out to larger developers, and they sublease it out to smaller developers, and so on, to people with apartments, and there's a stream of income that goes up. It'd be fairly easy. I mean, it's just a security, and you can make tokenized securities fairly easily. So that would be an amazing way to make hyper liquid assets that would represent the value of a startup city. So that would, as Matt said, it has huge potential because of special economic zones. They haven't really been open to the general public in terms of investment. They're not really widely known, but if you have a token, you can get investment from all over the world, which would be amazing.
McKibbinopolis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
McKinsonati.
It's going to happen. So.
I hope to God that never actually happens.
I hope there's going to be a McKibbinopolis. I just want you to know that.
So Matt, brass tacks, what do you think are some of the most impactful blockchain applications that we could make for startup cities?
So I think there's a lot of them. I think that most of our city infrastructure and our governance infrastructure is going to be on some sort of decentralized application in the future. I don't know when that timeline is, but like if you think about the different governance dApps that are coming about, so identity is one that we talked about a lot. It seems silly and I've said this plenty of times before, but it seems silly if you were going to create a new charter city with new rules and you wouldn't really have a DMV, right? The DMV seems like a really inefficient way of doing our identity services with government. Everyone hates the DMV. You go in, it takes hours and hours and hours. So you would, in some way, privatize that, and you would have an identity decentralized application that you could access, and then maybe there would be tokens or some sort of credits or reputations that are given to that identity for, let's say, your driving permissions, or whether you're some sort of civic responsibility, or something to interact there. You would have a web of trust to ensure that if something got hacked, you could redeem them with your friends unless you all got hacked. And so there's obviously technical vulnerabilities in some of this stuff that haven't been ironed out yet, but I think whoever solves those problems is going to be a billionaire. So that's a pretty good incentive structure. Property registration, we've talked a lot about that over the course of the past day. I think that's one of the ones that really is pretty obvious. We're recording information that we don't want people to mess with about who owns what on a public, transparent ledger that we can all write to, but no one can go back and erase. So that kind of makes sense. And then the interactions of your identity, with that thing to show that your identity signed off on the contract to purchase that token that represents ownership in some sort. Energy, like we said, we can do microgrids or decentralized energy grids of some sort, at least. If you're going to build it from the ground up, if you're going to build a new zone, you wouldn't be using diesel. You're going to be using solar and wind and something that's sustainable.
You're forgetting about John Cronin here, BuildCoin.
BuildCoin, right? BuildCoin Foundation. You would want all of the infrastructure spending to be transparent and all of the vendors to have reputation, and I think that's a pretty good one. There's some that are like tokenizing, like environmental responsibility. There's some of the carbon credit kind of stuff, which is not necessarily, but how do you value or how do you incentivize ensuring that we have environmental sustainability and restoration from the start?
So one element, so you talked about property rights, but one of the big things that it's a hard nut to crack. It's about adjudication of disputes. And there's been a couple of startups that have been tried to crack that nut, but I don't think it's been done in any substantive way. The biggest example being BitNation. What do you think would be the best route? I mean, I'm biased here because I help. So Tom right here, we're working together on ULEX. It's an amazing application, and I think, it's based on the best practices of international and private courts. It sounds strange, but the big innovation with ULEX is that it's not an innovation. It's already used. People already use it right now. And if we're able to essentially automate it through, a good portion of it through smart contracts, of course, here's one thing that the blockchain community has often gotten wrong. Code is not law. Law is messy, it requires iterations, and it needs to be updated constantly. And a big example of that was the DAO hack, the DAO Slockit hack. Because of, if you guys are familiar, the DAO Slockit hack, there was a big hack of millions and millions of dollars. And what they did, Ethereum, they actually rolled back the transactions. I think they did a fork in order to do that.
They did. It
was very controversial. But the real interesting thing is that the hacker tried to sue because they said it was rightfully theirs, because if they were just going according to the code. And if code was law, what they did was vindicated. So that brings up a lot of thorny issues right there. But what ULEX provides is that it allows judges, like real people, to update the law and to look at the body of law based on the restatements and to make judgments based off of that. So I think it's a good, that's one thing about blockchain technology and SEZs. There needs to be a human element. You can't just assume that you can code for everything or do a smart contract for each individual thing, because of surprise, surprise, people in cities are messy, and it can't be always immutable.
Right, and so the history should be immutable of what has happened, but definitely you need to have humans interpreting and being able to have controls to make the right decisions, at least for now. And I totally agree. I want to learn more about Ulix. I missed that presentation this morning, unfortunately. Had a breakfast.
I'm sure Tom will more than happy
Yeah.
to abide by that.
It'd be interesting to take a look at. And so there's Claros is one that's doing dispute resolution online. I think they're focusing on some specific niche, like online actual dispute resolution versus like physical dispute resolution. I think like, some of the more theoretical kind of stuff, defense, private defense insurance of some sort.
Yeah.
In our current model, a lot of the system gets paid when violence happens. So if you're getting fined, the state's getting money when violence occurs. That's a perverse incentive system. So we want to make sure that people are making money when there's peace, and that people are paying out when there's violence. So if there's a way of flipping that of some sort, I think in startup societies maybe they'll figure that out. I don't think that prison systems are like in terms of looking at the old systems. I don't think prison systems are great at rehabilitating people and putting them back into the population as a reformed and bright and wonderful citizen. Putting them in a violent cage with other people that don't like it doesn't really usually help.
I hope I never hear the phrase, let's put prison on the blockchain.
Right, no, I don't want to do that. But I think that different types of DAOs and ways of evolving those systems and will come about, and I think that the ways of creating those new systems will be in zones that we get to make and try out our new experimental laws.
So here's actually a point that I've been thinking about with a bunch of other people in this crowd right here. And it might turn off some of the more decentralists in the crowd. Is there a marginal utility to decentralization? Does governance have to be contiguous or based on geography? And that's one of the key differences between special economic zones and blockchain tech. Blockchain tech can be, as Max said, it can be polycentric. You can have your neighbor in your apartment have a different government than you. But the question is the transaction cost too high for that? If you have to constantly have third-party adjudicating disputes because you have a different government, isn't that too high? Is there what economists call a natural monopoly when it comes to governance? Now, that's not to say that you should have a large space. That probably doesn't make sense. Obviously, the point of this conference is that nation states aren't nimble enough to change effectively. But is there sort of a middle ground where there's small geographic areas that are more effective than governance versus polycentric? And I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think for now, having a physical jurisdiction to tie some sort of online jurisdiction to is the way to go. I think the online borderless voluntary nations, BitNation and Culture and those ones that are out there, I don't think that that's effective at this point in time. I think it's cool experimentation, I think it's cool rhetoric, but I think you need to tie to a physical jurisdiction, so the special economic zones, and as much, I would say sovereignty, or the much delegation of authority within that zone to the traditional government services. So like within the ZEDI framework, I think that's one of the most permissive legislation where you have delegation of authority of everything but military and passports.
Yeah, courts, administration,
so you can pick the ones around the world that you want, and you can pull different types of regulations. You can do demo at scale. There's a large kind of regulatory arbitrage market for that. But eventually, if you can kind of think of it, if there's enough of these kind of dispute resolution DAOs and enforcement DAOs, and they're all kind of interacting with each other, and this, I would say, 10 years in the future maybe, or more, but it wouldn't matter necessarily where you were physically. If they knew where you were and they knew what you were doing, and you might have to give up a lot of privacy in terms of this, but you could potentially have kind of a market for your dispute resolution agencies around the world. And I'd say that one of the cool lines that I think David Orban said this to me once was, we know that we'll kind of have won in this network society, decentralized governance movement when you'd rather go to the DecentraNet embassy services than the United States embassy services, right? And right now you want to go to the United States embassy services because they've got the most guns and the most power and the most influence. But if we can grow those decentralized networks of services and make them more competent, you'd rather go to that than the old state ones because they're inefficient or less powerful. Then we've won that kind of war for governance services.
Agreed. That should probably be the long-term view. And I mean, the whole point of whether there's a marginal utility decentralization or there's a natural monopoly, that can be sort of solved with the build, don't argue ethos. If it is true, it'll demonstrate itself empirically. But I think one thing that blockchain, and I don't mean to harp on blockchain people because they're doing amazing work, but I just think one thing why people call them utopians is because they think that their models don't have to have reference to the existing legacy governments or the legacy institutions. And when you're designing all these legacy, these blockchain governance systems, it's not really in reference to best practices of existing governments. I mean, like with things like a BitNation or Culture, and I'm not belittling them. Governments aren't enforcing their contracts ultimately, and that's at the end of the day what matters. If a government will allow these things to happen, then it'll be actually enforceable. And even if you could say like, okay, a smart contract, it executes automatically. So if you have a certain amount of coinage, it automatically transfers, and that's how you penalize people. But at the end of the day, institutional players in a large segment of the economy, and the vast majority of people who have no idea about crypto, that's not going to matter to them. They're not going to start participating in that system unless there's sort of an opt-in by existing governments.
Right, and I would assume that the ones that build from the ground up and have a tokenized society before the other ones, completely taking away access to your funds and ability to do things in a completely tokenized society would be like you can't go anywhere, and people would enforce, they would be able to read. It's like that Black Mirror episode where they have the social score, and they just society kind of goes, you can't go here. We're going to physically prevent you from if you have misbehaved and all of those types of things. I don't want that necessarily. I'm just kind of using it as.
Can we even talk about that? I don't mean to be the pessimist in the room, but I think it's a really interesting part of how blockchain governance can go wrong. Because for low context for people, how many have heard about the Chinese credit Sesame system? Yeah, okay, a lot. So it's scary when it's in China. Imagine when it's everywhere and it has an immutable ledger. Now that's crypto totalitarianism, and it's absolutely terrifying.
And it's enforced by robots.
Yeah. So that could be an absolutely terrifying proposition. So I think we need to create an alternative system because if that becomes attractive to people, because there's a lot of ways, if it gains a network effect, that could reduce a lot of transaction costs. But that means it'll tie us in. It's like, have you ever tried to quit Facebook? You can't. It's because everyone uses it. Now think of if everyone was using the social credit system and everyone was accepting it, even if it was making your life absolutely miserable, you couldn't opt out of it. So we need to I think it should be a priority in the blockchain community to make some sort of alternative to the credit system before someone tries to put it on the blockchain.
Well, and I mean, China is not necessarily on the blockchain, it's just they're controlling the database that says all of those types of things. It doesn't matter if it's on the blockchain or not there. But I think that the core values of the cryptocurrency decentralization movement, creating those movements of those people with those values. So for example, like EOS, Timothy Lewis is in the audience here, and we were at the EOS LA meetup. And he gave an awesome presentation on the capabilities of EOS and where you can go to get more information and register your tokens. But the most important part that I took out of it that I remember is the community portion of it. And so he made a comment of you're going to have to be voting for these block producers. You're going to have to be voting for the people that are going to be making decisions and maintaining the network. It's not just do the proof of work algorithm and let it go. So he said, you might want to pay attention to this as much as you pay attention to your local government politics. Maybe more, because it might have more influence on your life eventually in these community standards that you actually have active participation in these blockchain-based governance structures. And I can see if if and when EOS is massively successful, that you could build your entire local city governance structures on top of EOS, and it's a community-based standards in which you can see where everyone's doing everything, you can see the process by which they're making decisions, and it's much easier to participate because you can see what's happening online versus going down to your local city hall and seeing what the local bureaucrats are doing. No one goes to those things.
Right.
And when they do, they just go, oh, this is ridiculous, I'm getting out of here. Because you can't really make any changes. But if it's online participation and you see what the people are doing, what the that could encourage more participation from an intentional community that really cares about what happens.
So that sounds like very much like a direct democracy model. I can see a lot of benefits to that, but it's also a fairly attention. You need a lot of attention into it. I know you're a big fan of liquid democracy. Do you want to talk to the crowd about its application for blockchain tech?
I mean, yeah. So I think that liquid democracy is a way, a better way than we're currently doing it. But being able to delegate some choices within your vote to people that may have a lot more information about that topic. So, for example, if your senator is, going to make a decision on nuclear regulations, and he doesn't have any science background whatsoever, he's been a politician, you might want to be able to delegate that decision making to someone or nonprofit or a PhD nuclear scientist near you that might know a little bit more about what that decision should make and what it would do to your community versus the lobbying groups that got him elected and that's how he's going to vote. And making that transparent and being able to make it liquid and fluid where you could easily take those voting rights away from someone on the system and put them to somewhere else. I think that's much better than we currently have. But I mean, our system currently isn't designed for blockchain technology and the governance tech that we're kind of envisioning. And so that to me, I don't know that liquid democracy necessarily is the end all be all, but I would much rather be able to take authority away from people and give it to people that I believe have more of my best interests and more expertise on the topic in real time.
So one point of contention in the crypto community is how we go about instituting blockchain governance. Some, it's very much of a subversive, we just create the alternative, we create a better party, and then people go to it. And there's other people like Consensus that go directly to nation states or other governments in order to institute their platforms. What do you think is the correct route? I mean, obviously it's not a binary, it could be a mixture of things. I mean, we could just do it through special economic zones and that would be the middle ground.
I think the special economic zones route is the best one. Divide the United States into 1 million special economic zones. Let's do it. But no, 300 million. There we go. We're each one. No, I mean, building the pilots that what Consensus is doing and building those types of hopefully dApps that there is fine. We need people to build out infrastructure. There's a lot of work to be done. Whether you can even build those and have mass scale usership on Ethereum is still in question. And so whether that would have to go on to another third or fourth generation kind of distributed ledger technology for communities. But we haven't even seen a large scale community actually function on any of these things yet. So I think that the state, other than like Dubai is putting a lot of the processes on there, that doesn't mean they're giving more power to people that live there.
Right, they're mostly just streamlining.
They're streamlining existing things. But intentional communities, special economic zones where you design and have different experiments, I think that's where you're going to see the most kind of innovation in these governance models. And they're not going to be a I hope there's not a one-size-fits-all, right? Yeah. I hope that there's experimentation and you can choose to have what type of governance you want, and it's an easy, fluid exit when you want to choose to something else. And I think the usability, or the people actually using it and participating is going to matter on the participation and how easy it is to do that. Just like it is if you're trying to use Bitcoin right now and you've never done it before, there's still a really big technical leap to get over. You don't just get into it. And so the civic participation, the participation is still going to have to be that easy as getting on Venmo or Facebook and participating.
So I have a feeling that the audience wants a couple of questions on this specific topic. Do you want to open it up a little bit?
Yep.
All right, see, I knew it. All right, Greg.
So, so often with the topics that come up in this community, including seasteading and the decentralization, I think about Neil Stephenson. Yeah, snow crash and cruising across LA and crossing all these zones and everything's automatically read.
Birdclaves.
Birdclaves.
Even the DMV is this sort of like, who gives a shit about the DMV in LA? It's, you know, it's the only thing it's good for is this or that. It's all part of this thing. So I'm big on cities, and that if you do the city scale, which could be a big city or a small city, then these interaction costs and interaction efficiency, you could get some economies of scale there. But in his scenario, it's even smaller. It's more like districts. So sort of a comment, but a question in terms of, to me, and also, I mean, it'd be wonderful to have him speaking at one of the events.
That's an attention.
Clearly, he's thought this
Put a pin
through
in that. Let's do
about
that.
this super fragmented, where a corporate identity far outweighs any sort of sovereign or national identity.
He's a recluse, by the way.
Yeah, he's hard.
We'll get him on the video screen.
I think on his website he says that I will likely not speak at your event, and if I do, I'm expensive.
Yeah, so I mean, the one comment I'll say is that, yes, I totally think that having districts, but in the invention with DAOs, it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical jurisdiction. It can be an organization that's non-geographical that still arbitrates on your behalf in different areas, right? As you move from area to area, and they can have their own agreements within each other, and then have third-party dispute resolution organizations that, it's all theoretical, right, on how to do that. So, but yeah, so I don't think it would necessarily be like moving from, you know, block to block, and they have the different burbclaves. I think it would be more fluid, that whatever exists, we can come up with really easy ways for the DAOs to kind of interact. But I do like Snow Crash a lot.
I was thinking exactly that same thing, the question that was in my mind, but I kind of want to dive in a little bit deeper on the dispute resolution portion too, because David Freeman just was writing about that also. Machinery Freeman is source text for a lot of this idea. But I've never seen in the dispute, and I have in my own simulations trying to run it up, in dispute resolution, when your representative, dispute resolution representative, is the same as the person you have the dispute with, who's the arbitrator. And you've got the same corporate, quote unquote, commercial enterprise trying to dispute itself for you between two parties.
So Tom could probably talk better about this than I, but usually even prior to a dispute happening, when you have a contract, you already have a third party set in mind. Who isn't involved in any of your business dealings, who would be a third party. And also in many polycentric law cases, there is a appellate court circuit. I mean, it's a more like decentralized private version of appellate courts. But if you have trouble with your first adjudicating service, you can go to a third party appellate who is not involved in any of it at all in order to adjudicate it.
So you might skip through one level to another.
Right. And usually, I think there's like 2 or 3 levels, and then they just like null and void. There's no more appellate courts.
In government systems, yes.
Okay.
Private adjudication usually does not have, they offer sometimes an option, appellate review, but usually commercial parties just want to get their dispute resolved cheaply. And because they trust the system in the first instance, they don't build appellate review in because they just trust it.
That's another benefit of that. You usually avoid all those problems altogether. And obviously, there's outliers, but they have a built-in check.
On the topic of these natural monopolies or whatever, I would offer that there really ultimately is nothing but ownership, property ownership, which is a natural monopoly. You don't own, you know, a pinpoint-sized piece of land. You own what you need. And then I think for your dispute resolution, there's no reason you have to have the same one as your neighboring property. I don't see there any natural monopoly that way. That the only natural monopoly is right now there's some nation state that's going to claim you as their property. And you need someone to effectively be able to tell all the nation states of the world, no, you can't claim this person. So as long as there's a claim by these nation states, then there's this natural monopoly. But otherwise, I would offer that it's just as easy to have two separate dispute resolution providers providing right next to each other as it is to have a Canadian citizen living next to me in Minnesota where I live, as it is a U.S. citizen. They just work it out. So anyway, that was.
So that's an interesting point, and I don't want to get too abstract or split hairs here because we're trying to be concrete. But I think this is an important thought experiment for a lot of, liberty-minded or centralist-minded SEZ people in the crowd. So the definition of a state is a monopoly force over a given territory. That's essentially the same definition as property. So I'm going to ask you this: what is the difference between a small state and a large property?
I'd say that a state actually has control over people in a region, whereas property is just control over, dead property. It's not control over.
Doesn't a landlord have conditions for the renters?
You only have an exclusionary right. You don't have control to force everything on people like a state does.
Right.
But you can. Well, that's a state too. It's just
Owning property as a state?
No, the state can only keep people out. It
No,
can't
the
like
state- the state can
enforce
force
things
law-
outside.
The state can force laws on people within that state.
Yeah.
Which a landlord cannot do.
So
I believe you can.
we got one more minute, you guys, so let's try to get one more question in
Yeah,
there.
right there.
Two basically messy cybersecurity issues. And things like, like algorithm bias and algorithm transparency, get more work being done, by the cloud. Everybody know what is being made.
Yeah, I would say that definitely cybersecurity concerns in holding tokens and identities and those things are going to have to be adapted
They shouldn't
massively.
be assumed away.
Right, no, they're not assumed away, and there's a lot of theoretical context. The algorithm, I would assume that when we are building these decentralized communities, we're gonna have open source software that's running these community-based EOSs and open source software. I wouldn't trust closed source software, and I wouldn't want my government running on closed source software. In that sense, if I was going to have the choice to participate in an open source one where I know what everything's going on and have the ability to audit it and have the ability to have people get paid to audit it and make sure what's going on, I assume there would be auditing services of what the decisions were made into a easy to understand brief for the citizen of some sort. All right.
Well, you guys are the real think tank, so thank you for coming to
Thank
talk.
you.